Victoria Sterling stands frozen in Preston Academy's packed auditorium as decorated war hero Marcus Brennan reveals his Purple Heart. The millionaire who mocked his rusted truck moments ago watches her perfectly constructed world crumble. His next words will expose a truth that changes everything she believes about success, sacrifice, and what real strength looks like. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The parking lot of Preston Academy was a parade of wealth on this crisp October morning. Mercedes SUVs gleamed next to Tesla Model X's, their paint jobs so pristine they seemed to repel the autumn leaves drifting down from the maples lining the private school's entrance. Marcus Brennan's 1998 Ford F-150 rumbled into this display of affluence like a time traveler from a different era, its faded blue paint bearing the scars of 25 years and 300,000 miles. The truck's engine coughed once before settling into an idle that sounded more like a death rattle than the purr of machinery. Marcus gripped the steering wheel for a moment, his calloused hands steady despite the anxiety churning in his stomach. In the rearview mirror, he caught sight of his daughter Emma, her face pressed against the window, taking in the imposing brick buildings of her new school. At 7 years old, she had her mother's delicate features, but his determined jaw, a combination that made his heart ache every time he looked at her. This school was supposed to be her chance, the opportunity he'd fought so hard to give her after everything they'd lost. Victoria Sterling was having one of those mornings where everything aligned perfectly, which should have been her first warning that the universe was about to throw her a curveball. Her champagne-colored Bentley Continental glided into the Preston Academy parking lot with the kind of quiet elegance that whispered, rather than shouted its six-figure price tag. At 35, Victoria had built her luxury real estate empire from nothing, transforming herself from a small-town girl with big dreams into one of the most successful brokers on the East Coast. Her blonde hair, professionally highlighted and styled that morning at 6 a.m. by her personal stylist, caught the morning sun as she stepped out of her car. The Hermes bag on her arm cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, and her Jimmy Choo heels clicked against the pavement with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. She was here for the monthly Parent Association meeting, where she served as treasurer, a position that allowed her to network with the kind of clients who bought houses the way other people bought shoes. The truck parked 3 spaces over from her Bentley was an affront to everything Preston Academy represented, or so Victoria thought as she watched it wheeze to a stop. The vehicle looked like it might fall apart if someone slammed the door too hard, rust eating at its wheel wells like cancer. She watched with barely concealed disdain as a man climbed out, dressed in clean but clearly worn jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. His boots were scuffed work boots, the kind that actually saw work rather than being a fashion statement. He moved around to help a small girl from the back seat, lifting her down with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. The child's uniform was pristine, Victoria noted, even if it looked like it might be second-hand. The man's face was weathered, carved with lines that spoke of stress and sleepless nights rather than age. He couldn't be more than 38 or 39, she estimated, but life had clearly not been kind to him. Marcus felt the woman's stare like a physical weight as he helped Emma with her backpack. He'd gotten used to these looks over the past year, the mixture of confusion and contempt from people wondering how someone like him could afford Preston Academy. They didn't know about the education fund from the life insurance, the money he'd carefully hoarded and invested, every penny earmarked for Emma's future. They didn't know he worked 3 jobs to cover their living expenses so that fund could remain untouched for her education. They just saw the truck, the clothes, the calloused hands, and made their judgments. Emma, bless her heart, was oblivious to the tension. She chattered excitedly about her upcoming science presentation, her small hand wrapped trustingly in his as they walked toward the entrance. That trust was everything to Marcus. It was what got him up at 4 every morning for his first shift at the warehouse, what kept him going through his afternoon construction job, what gave him the energy for his evening security work. Victoria found herself walking behind them, close enough to overhear their conversation. The man's voice was deep but gentle as he listened to his daughter describe her project about butterflies, asking questions that showed he was truly engaged, despite what must have been exhaustion she could see in the set of his shoulders. Something about the interaction nagged at her, disrupting the neat categories she used to organize the world. Poor people who sent their children to Preston were usually desperate social climbers, leveraging every penny to give their kids a chance at the connections that mattered. But this man seemed entirely focused on his daughter, not even glancing at the other parents pulling up in their luxury vehicles. As they reached the entrance, Victoria quickened her pace, her heels clicking more insistently. She had a reputation to maintain after all. The other parents would be watching, waiting to see how she handled this obvious intrusion into their carefully curated world. The moment of collision came at the doorway. Emma had dropped her science project folder, papers scattering in the morning breeze. Marcus immediately knelt to help her gather them, his broad back blocking the entrance. Victoria, checking her phone for messages from her assistant, didn't see them until it was too late. Her heel caught on Marcus's outstretched foot, sending her stumbling. Her phone flew from her manicured hands, landing with an expensive crack on the concrete. The contents of her Hermes bag scattered across the ground, lipsticks rolling, business cards flying, and her Mont Blanc pen skittering under a nearby bench. For a moment, everything stopped. Marcus looked up from his kneeling position, his green eyes meeting Victoria's blue ones with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something in those eyes, a depth of experience and pain that her money had insulated her from ever having to truly understand. Marcus reacted on instinct, muscle memory from a different life taking over. Even before Victoria could fully process what had happened, he was moving, one hand steadying her elbow to keep her from falling completely, the other already reaching for her scattered belongings. His movements were efficient, practiced, the kind of automatic response trained into him through years of service. But as his hand closed around her phone, noting the spiderweb crack across its screen, he saw the moment her expression shifted from surprise to anger. He'd seen that look before, in a dozen different countries, on 100 different faces. It was the look of someone who'd just found a convenient target for their frustration. Victoria jerked her arm away from his steadying hand, as if his touch had burned her. The gentle concern in his eyes only infuriated her more, making her feel somehow small, despite her designer clothes and impressive bank account. "Look what you've done," Victoria snapped, her voice carrying that particular tone of indignation reserved for those who believe the world should bend to their will. "This phone costs more than that thing you drove here." She gestured dismissively at his truck, her perfectly manicured nails catching the light. "Maybe if you watched where you were going, instead of sprawling all over the entrance, like you own the place." The words came out sharp and bitter, fueled by more than just the morning's mishap. She was having a bad week, a deal falling through that would have netted her $250,000 in commission, and this man with his ancient truck and his work boots represented everything she'd fought to leave behind. Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate and calm, despite the flush of anger he felt rising in his chest. He'd learned long ago that reacting to provocation only made things worse, especially when Emma was watching. His daughter had pressed herself against his leg, her small hand clutching his jeans, confused by the angry lady's voice. "I apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am," Marcus said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet dignity that somehow made Victoria feel even smaller. His hand extended, offering her phone and the other items he'd collected. "Let me know the cost of the repair, and I'll take care of it." The words were measured, professional, but there was something in his tone that suggested he'd had practiced de-escalating situations far more dangerous than an upset parent in a school parking lot. Victoria snatched her belongings from his hands, shoving them back into her bag with sharp, angry movements. She was about to deliver another cutting remark, when she noticed the small girl looking up at her with wide, frightened eyes. The child's face was so earnest, so innocent, that for a moment Victoria felt a flicker of something she quickly suppressed. Guilt was for people who had time for such luxuries. Emma's voice was small but clear in the tense silence. "Daddy didn't mean to hurt your things, miss. Sometimes accidents just happen. That's what Daddy tells me when I spill my juice." The simple honesty in the child's words should have diffused the situation, but Victoria was too deep in her own narrative to back down now. Other parents were beginning to arrive, and she could feel their eyes on the scene. She needed to establish dominance, to make it clear that standards would be maintained despite whatever charity case the school had admitted. "Well, maybe your daddy should teach you that actions have consequences," Victoria said, her tone ice cold as she directed her words at Marcus rather than the child. "And that some places have standards that need to be maintained. This isn't a public school where anything goes." The implication hung heavy in the air, as clear as if she'd spelled it out in neon letters. "You don't belong here." Marcus's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble he hadn't had time to shave that morning. He'd been up since 4, getting in 3 hours at the warehouse before coming here, and he had 8 more hours of work ahead of him after dropping Emma off, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the way his daughter's shoulders had hunched at the woman's words, the way her confidence dimmed like someone had thrown a switch. That was a line he wouldn't let anyone cross. With deliberate calm, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, worn leather that had traveled with him to places this woman couldn't imagine. He extracted a business card, nothing fancy, just his name and number for his handyman service, and held it out to her. "Send me the bill for the phone," he repeated, his voice carrying an edge now, steel beneath the courtesy. "I take responsibility for my actions, ma'am. All of them." Victoria took the card with 2 fingers, as if it might contaminate her, and glanced at it with obvious disdain. Marcus Brennan, Handyman Services. No website, no logo, just a phone number and an email address. She laughed, a sound like crystal breaking, sharp and tinkling and somehow cruel. "A handyman, of course. Tell me, Mr. Brennan, how exactly does a handyman afford Preston Academy? Did you win the lottery? Or is this some kind of scholarship situation?" She said the word scholarship like it tasted bad in her mouth, her voice pitched to carry to the other parents now gathering at the entrance. "Let me guess, a diversity initiative? The school's attempt at charity work?" The questions were rhetorical, designed to humiliate rather than inquire. She was building her audience now, other parents slowing their stride to catch the drama unfolding at the school entrance. Before Marcus could respond, a man's voice cut through the morning air. "Victoria, that's enough." Richard Ashworth approached, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sun. As president of the Parent Association and a federal judge, his presence commanded immediate attention. He'd been watching from his car, debating whether to intervene, but the look on the little girl's face had made the decision for him. Mr. Brennan has as much right to be here as anyone else, perhaps more than most. The last comment was directed pointedly at Victoria, who had the grace to flush slightly. Richard positioned himself between Victoria and Marcus, his body language making it clear whose side he was taking. Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose in surprise. Surely Richard wasn't defending this obvious interloper. She'd worked too hard cultivating her position in Preston's social hierarchy to have it undermined by misplaced sympathy. "Richard, surely you understand the importance of maintaining certain standards," Victoria began, her tone shifting to something more conciliatory, but still condescending. "We have a reputation to protect, property values to consider. When people see vehicles like that in our parking lot, what message does it send?" She gestured again at Marcus's truck, the vehicle becoming a symbol of everything she felt threatened her carefully constructed world. "The message," Richard said quietly but firmly, "is that Preston Academy values education and character over material wealth. At least that's what we claim in our mission statement. Or have you forgotten that part during your parent association meetings?" His tone carried the kind of authority that came from decades on the bench, making judgments about human character that had nothing to do with bank accounts. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but Richard had already turned to Marcus, extending his hand for a firm handshake. Marcus accepted the handshake, grateful for the intervention, but uncomfortable with being the center of this much attention. He just wanted to get Emma to class and get to his second job on time. The construction foreman didn't care about his personal dramas, only whether he could swing a hammer for 8 hours straight. But Emma was still pressed against his leg, and he could feel her trembling slightly. This wasn't the morning he'd wanted for her, not when she'd been so excited about her science presentation. "Judge Ashworth," Marcus said with a nod of recognition. He'd done his research on all the important figures at Preston when Emma had been accepted. "Thank you, but we should be getting to class. Emma has a presentation today." His hand rested protectively on his daughter's shoulder, the gesture both comforting and defensive. Victoria couldn't let it go. Not with other parents watching, not with her carefully maintained image at stake. A presentation? How wonderful! "Tell me, Emma, is it a presentation about how your daddy's truck is held together with duct tape and prayer? Or maybe about how many jobs he has to work to pretend you belong here?" The words were cruel, aimed at the child now, because she sensed it would hurt Marcus more than any direct attack. It was a miscalculation that would cost her more than she could imagine. Emma's chin lifted, a gesture so reminiscent of her father's quiet dignity that it made Marcus's chest tight with pride. Her voice was clear and strong, despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "My presentation is about metamorphosis," she said, the big word carefully pronounced, "about how caterpillars turn into butterflies. My daddy taught me that sometimes the most beautiful things come from difficult changes." The innocence and wisdom in the child's response created a moment of complete silence. Even the morning birds seemed to pause their singing. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion, remembering teaching Emma about butterflies after her mother's death, using the metaphor to help her understand why their life had changed so drastically. He'd never imagined she'd internalized the lesson so deeply. Victoria, however, was too deep in her own anger to appreciate the moment. She was about to respond when she noticed something glinting at Marcus's collar, barely visible beneath his flannel shirt. It was a small pin, subtle enough that most wouldn't notice, but her grandfather had worn something similar, a purple heart. The recognition hit her like cold water, but she pushed it aside. Lots of people bought military memorabilia at thrift stores or online, using false valor to gain sympathy or respect they hadn't earned. "Nice touch with the pin," Victoria said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Where did you buy it? eBay? Or was it a flea market find? Amazing what people will do for sympathy these days. Stolen valor is quite the trend, I hear." She'd crossed a line, and everyone present knew it. The other parents who had been watching with the morbid fascination of motorists passing an accident now shifted uncomfortably. Even those who might have privately agreed with her concerns about maintaining standards recognized the accusation as going too far. Marcus went completely still, the kind of stillness that anyone who'd served would recognize as dangerous. His hand moved unconsciously to his collar, touching the pin that he wore every day, not for show, but as a reminder of brothers lost and prices paid. Richard Ashworth's face had gone pale with anger. "Ms. Sterling, I think you should stop talking now." His voice carried the kind of judicial authority that brooked no argument. "You're displaying an ignorance that's beneath even you." But Victoria was too invested in her narrative to back down. She'd built her entire identity on being right, on knowing how to read people and situations, on maintaining control. "Oh, Richard, you're too trusting. People claim military service all the time for benefits and sympathy. I'm simply suggesting we verify before we accept every sob story that walks through these gates." She turned back to Marcus, her blue eyes cold as winter sky. "So tell us, Mr. Brennan, where did you serve? What unit? I'm sure you have all the details memorized for your little performance." The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, and Victoria stood with her arms crossed, certain she'd exposed a fraud. Marcus remained silent for a long moment, his green eyes fixed on Victoria, with an intensity that made her want to step back despite herself. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, each word measured and precise. 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. Purple Heart from an IED outside Kandahar that killed 2 of my brothers and nearly took my left leg. Bronze Star with valor for pulling 3 men from a burning Humvee under enemy fire. The details came without emotion, stated as simple facts rather than boasts. Would you like to see the scars to verify, or would you prefer to call the VA and check my records? The quiet dignity in his delivery made each word land like a physical blow to Victoria's carefully constructed assumptions. The silence that followed was deafening. Parents who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. Victoria's face had gone from confident skepticism to something approaching horror as the reality of what she'd accused him of began to sink in. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came. She looked like someone who had just realized they'd been standing on thin ice, hearing it crack beneath their feet. Richard Ashworth's expression had shifted from anger to something like grim satisfaction. He'd known Marcus's background, had seen his service records when the man had applied for a hardship scholarship for Emma. The board had unanimously approved it after reading about his service and his wife's death from cancer 2 years ago, leaving him to raise Emma alone while dealing with his own PTSD and physical rehabilitation. Emma tugged on her father's hand, her young voice cutting through the tension with innocent concern. "Daddy, are you okay? You're doing the breathing thing Dr. Sarah taught you." The child's observation revealed another layer of Marcus's reality. The therapy sessions for PTSD, the breathing exercises to manage anxiety and anger, the daily battle with demons that Victoria Sterling couldn't begin to imagine. Marcus looked down at his daughter, his expression softening immediately. He knelt to her level, his movements betraying a slight stiffness in his left leg that Victoria now noticed for the first time. "I'm fine, Butterfly. Just remembering some things. But we're here now, and that's what matters. You ready for your presentation?" The transformation in his demeanor when addressing his daughter was complete, from hardened soldier to gentle father in the space of a heartbeat. Victoria felt something cold and sharp twisting in her stomach. It was shame, though she'd rarely experienced it deeply enough to recognize it immediately. She'd built her empire on reading people, on making quick judgments that usually served her well in business. But here, in this moment, she'd been so catastrophically wrong that it made her question every assumption she'd ever made. The man she'd dismissed as a deadbeat, accused of stolen valor, was exactly what he claimed to be, and more. A war hero raising his daughter alone, working multiple jobs to give her an education at Preston Academy. The very kind of American success story she claimed to admire when it was sanitized and presented at charity galas, but apparently couldn't recognize when it stood before her, in work boots and flannel. Other parents were beginning to react now, their whispers creating a low buzz of conversation. Catherine Chen, whose husband was a Marine colonel, stepped forward and offered her hand to Marcus with obvious respect. "Thank you for your service didn't seem adequate, so she simply said, 'Semper Fi,' though I'm guessing you Rangers have your own saying." Marcus accepted the handshake with a small smile, the first genuine warmth he'd shown since the confrontation began. "Rangers lead the way, ma'am, but we all bled the same color over there." The simple exchange carried more genuine respect than Victoria had experienced in months of parent association meetings, and she found herself standing apart, isolated by her own cruelty. Judge Ashworth cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the immediate situation. "I think we should all get our children to class. Mr. Brennan, Emma, would you walk with me? I'd like to hear about this butterfly presentation." His tone made it clear this wasn't really a request, and equally clear that Victoria was not included in the invitation. As the small group moved toward the entrance, other parents fell in behind them, some nodding respectfully to Marcus, others carefully avoiding eye contact with Victoria. In the space of minutes, the social dynamics of Preston Academy's parent community had shifted dramatically, and Victoria found herself on the wrong side of that shift. Victoria stood alone in the parking lot, her Hermes bag clutched to her chest like armor, watching the group disappear into the school. The broken phone in her hand seemed to mock her, its cracked screen reflecting her fractured composure. She'd won every battle in her professional life, through aggression and intimidation, never backing down, never admitting fault. But this felt different. This felt like she'd revealed something ugly about herself that couldn't be unseen. A woman passing by, someone Victoria recognized from the charity circuit, but whose name she couldn't recall, paused just long enough to deliver a cutting observation. "You know, Victoria, money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy class, and it certainly can't buy back the respect you just lost." The woman walked on without waiting for a response, leaving Victoria standing beside her $100,000 car, feeling poorer than she'd ever felt in her life. Inside the school, Emma was chattering excitedly to Judge Ashworth about her butterfly presentation, her earlier distress seemingly forgotten with the resilience children possess. Marcus walked beside them, his posture military straight despite his fatigue. Richard noticed how other parents and staff members were looking at Marcus differently now, with curiosity and respect rather than the polite dismissal he'd probably grown accustomed to. The custodian, an elderly veteran himself, caught Marcus's eye and gave him a subtle nod of recognition, one warrior acknowledging another. These small gestures seemed to make Marcus uncomfortable, and Richard understood why. Men like Marcus didn't serve for recognition. They served for duty, for brothers in arms, for something larger than themselves. At Emma's classroom door, Marcus knelt again, his hands gentle as he straightened his daughter's collar and smoothed a stray hair from her face. "You're going to do great with your presentation, Butterfly. Remember what we practiced?" Emma nodded solemnly, then recited, "Speak clearly, make eye contact, and remember that everyone wants to learn about metamorphosis because it's amazing." Her father smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "That's my girl." "And what do we say when things get hard?" Emma's response was immediate and practiced. "We adapt and overcome, just like butterflies do." The phrase, obviously adapted from military culture for a 7-year-old's understanding, made Richard's throat tight with unexpected emotion. After Emma had disappeared into her classroom with a final wave, Marcus stood slowly, that telltale stiffness in his left leg more pronounced now. Richard noticed him unconsciously rubbing his thigh, probably where shrapnel or worse had done its damage. "Marcus," Richard said quietly, "I want to apologize for what happened out there. Victoria Sterling doesn't represent the values of this school or most of the parents here." Marcus shrugged, the gesture conveying years of similar experiences. "It's not your apology to make, Judge. And honestly, I'm used to it. People see the truck, the clothes, they make assumptions. Usually I just let it go. But when she went after Emma, when she tried to make my daughter feel small, that crossed a line." His voice carried an edge of protective fury that Richard recognized from his years on the bench, the voice of a parent who would move heaven and earth for their child. Meanwhile, Victoria had made it to her car, but couldn't bring herself to leave. She sat in the driver's seat staring at the school entrance, her mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. By noon, everyone in their social circle would know. By evening, it would be the talk of every private club and charity board in the city. Victoria Sterling, the woman who prided herself on being able to read anyone, had accused a Purple Heart recipient of stolen valor. In front of witnesses, the damage to her reputation would be significant, possibly irreparable in certain circles. But worse than the social consequences was the growing realization of what kind of person she'd become. When had she transformed from the ambitious girl with big dreams into someone who could be so casually cruel to a child? Her phone, cracked screen and all, began buzzing with text messages. Word was already spreading. One from her business partner simply read, "Heard what happened at Preston. We need to talk." Another from a charity board member, "Is it true what you said to that veteran?" The messages kept coming, each one another crack in the facade she'd spent years building. Victoria turned off the phone, unable to face the digital jury that was already convening to pass judgment on her actions. She looked across the parking lot at Marcus's old truck, really looked at it for the first time. What she'd dismissed as an eyesore now revealed itself differently. The truck was old, yes, but it was clean, well-maintained despite its age. There were 2 car seats in the extended cab, one obviously Emma's, the other smaller, suggesting Marcus perhaps helped other parents with pickup duties. A small decal on the rear window caught her eye. Something she hadn't noticed in her earlier disdain. It showed the Ranger tab and scroll, with a date underneath. When she did the math, she realized Marcus had been deployed during some of the worst years of the Afghanistan conflict. He'd been 22, 23 years old, barely more than a kid himself, fighting in mountains half a world away while she'd been in business school complaining about the stress of finals. The contrast was stark and humbling. She'd been given every advantage, every opportunity, and had used them to build walls between herself and people like Marcus. He'd been given a rifle and a flag, and had come home broken but still fighting, not for glory or recognition, but for his daughter's future. Victoria's reflection in her rearview mirror showed a woman she barely recognized. When had the hunger for success transformed into contempt for anyone she perceived as beneath her? When had protecting her status become more important than basic human decency? The questions had no comfortable answers. She thought about Emma's presentation on metamorphosis, the metaphor the child had unknowingly offered. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from difficult changes. But Victoria had never gone through difficult changes, not really. She'd faced challenges, yes, but always with a safety net, always with resources to cushion any fall. She'd never had to rebuild from complete destruction, never had to choose between her own needs and her child's, never had to swallow her pride and endure humiliation for someone else's sake. Her phone rang, the cracked screen lighting up with her assistant's number. Victoria let it go to voicemail, not ready to face the outside world yet. Through her windshield, she could see other parents arriving for the day's various activities, many of them casting curious glances at her car. She recognized the look in their eyes, the same judgment she'd directed at Marcus just minutes ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now the subject of the kind of gossip she'd often participated in, the cautionary tale that would be whispered about at lunch meetings and coffee dates. Victoria Sterling, brought low by her own arrogance, sitting alone in her luxury car while a man she'd tried to humiliate was inside being treated with the respect he'd always deserved but never demanded. Back inside the school, Marcus was trying to politely excuse himself from a growing group of parents who suddenly wanted to thank him for his service, invite him for coffee, include him in their social circles. He appreciated the gestures, but recognized them for what they often were: reflexive patriotism that felt good in the moment but rarely translated into genuine connection or support. He needed to get to his job at the construction site, needed to frame houses for the next 8 hours to earn the money that kept him and Emma afloat. But Richard Ashworth seemed to understand his discomfort and expertly extracted him from the well-meaning crowd. "Let me walk you to your truck," Richard offered, and Marcus gratefully accepted. As they walked, Richard spoke carefully, choosing his words with judicial precision. "Marcus, I want you to know that what happened today changes nothing about Emma's place here. If anything, it reinforces that she belongs at Preston. We need children like her, children who understand that character matters more than cash flow." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. The scholarship had been a godsend, but he'd always worried it might be revoked. Always felt like he was one complaint away from losing Emma's opportunity. "Thank you, Judge. It means everything to her, to both of us." They had reached the truck, and Marcus pulled out his keys. The keychain, a simple metal tag with Emma's baby photo protected by scratched plastic. Richard hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at him. "Why didn't you defend yourself immediately? Why let Victoria go on like that?" Marcus considered the question, running a calloused hand through his short hair. "Because men like me, Judge, we've learned that defending ourselves often makes things worse. People like Ms. Sterling, they've already made up their minds. My words wouldn't have changed anything. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "my daughter was watching. I wanted her to see that sometimes the high road is the only road worth taking, even when someone's trying to push you off it." The wisdom in that response, hard-earned and practical, made Richard respect the man even more. As Marcus climbed into his truck, Richard noticed the interior was spotlessly clean, despite the vehicle's age. No trash, no clutter, just a small photo clipped to the sun visor, a beautiful woman with Emma's eyes smiling at the camera. Marcus caught him looking and said simply, "My wife, Sarah. Cancer took her 2 years ago." The matter-of-fact delivery couldn't hide the pain that flickered across his face. Richard wanted to say something meaningful, but Marcus had already started the engine, the old truck rumbling to life with surprising vigor. "Take care, Judge, and thank you for stepping in. I've got to get to work." As the truck pulled away, Richard noticed Victoria still sitting in her car, watching. Their eyes met briefly through her windshield, and he saw something in her expression he'd never seen before: genuine remorse. Victoria watched Marcus's truck disappear into traffic, carrying a man who worked construction all day, after spending his morning being humiliated by someone who'd never known a day of real hardship. The contrast between their lives, their struggles, their characters, was so stark it felt like a physical weight on her chest. She thought about her morning routine: the personal trainer at 5, the stylist at 6, the carefully curated life designed to project success and power. Then she thought about Marcus's morning, probably up before dawn, getting Emma ready, making her breakfast, checking her homework, all while dealing with pain from injuries sustained serving their country. The comparison made her feel small and petty and wasteful. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from Emma's teacher, Mrs. Patterson. The message was brief, but pointed. Emma Brennan gave a beautiful presentation on butterflies and transformation today. She mentioned that her father taught her about finding beauty in change. Perhaps we could all learn from that lesson. The subtle rebuke was clear. Even the teaching staff had heard about the morning's incident. Victoria realized with a sinking feeling that she'd become the kind of parent teachers warned each other about. The kind who made their jobs harder, who treated the school like a country club where membership fees entitled them to cruelty. 3 days passed before Victoria found the courage to return to Preston Academy. She'd spent those days in a kind of self-imposed exile, canceling meetings, ignoring calls, sitting in her pristine penthouse apartment that suddenly felt more like a prison than a palace. The modern furniture, the abstract art, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, all of it seemed to mock her with its emptiness. She'd built a fortress of success around herself, but somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten to let life in. The irony wasn't lost on her that Marcus, in his modest circumstances, seemed to have more genuine wealth than she did. He had Emma, had purpose, had the respect of people who mattered. What did she have besides money and a reputation that was currently in tatters? On Thursday morning, she arrived at Preston Academy deliberately early, hoping to avoid the crowd of parents at drop-off time. But as she pulled into the parking lot, she saw Marcus's old Ford already there, parked in the same spot as before. Her chest tightened with anxiety, but also with something else. Determination, perhaps. Or maybe just the recognition that some mistakes couldn't be fixed by avoidance. She parked several spaces away and sat in her car for a moment, gathering courage she didn't know she needed. Through her windshield, she could see Marcus helping Emma out of the truck, the little girl animated about something, her hands moving expressively as she talked. The tenderness between father and daughter was so evident, it made Victoria's chest ache with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Taking a deep breath, Victoria stepped out of her Bentley and walked toward them before she could lose her nerve. Marcus noticed her approach, his body tensing slightly, positioning himself subtly between Victoria and Emma. The protective gesture was automatic, instinctive, and it made Victoria feel even worse about their last encounter. She stopped a respectful distance away, her hands clutching her purse like a lifeline. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone, "could I have a moment of your time?" Marcus studied her for a long moment, his green eyes unreadable. Then he looked down at Emma, whose expression had gone wary at the sight of the mean lady from Monday. "Emma, why don't you go ahead to class? I'll catch up in a minute," Marcus said gently. "But Daddy," Emma started to protest, clearly not wanting to leave her father alone with someone who had hurt them both. "It's okay, Butterfly. Sometimes adults need to talk about adult things. Remember what we said about giving people second chances?" Emma nodded reluctantly, then surprised everyone, including herself, by addressing Victoria directly. "My presentation went really good. I got an A+. Mrs. Patterson said my butterfly facts were extraordinary." The child's willingness to share this triumph, even with someone who had been unkind to her, revealed a generosity of spirit that Marcus had clearly nurtured. Victoria felt her throat tighten. "That's wonderful, Emma. Butterflies are quite amazing creatures." After Emma had walked into the school, casting one worried glance back at her father, Marcus and Victoria stood facing each other in the morning sun. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that needed to be said. Victoria had rehearsed this moment dozens of times over the past 3 days, but now, facing this man whose dignity she had tried to destroy, all her prepared words felt inadequate. Finally, she simply said what was true. "I'm sorry. I'm deeply, profoundly sorry for what I said, for how I behaved. There's no excuse for it." The apology came out rushed, desperate, nothing like the polished presentations she usually delivered. But it was honest, perhaps the most honest she'd been in years. Marcus remained silent, waiting. He'd learned in combat and in life that silence often revealed more than words. Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger, but also more vulnerable. "I accused you of stolen valor, the worst kind of accusation I could make against someone who served. I tried to humiliate you and Emma because I felt threatened by something I didn't understand. I've spent 3 days trying to figure out why I reacted that way, and the truth is ugly. I saw your truck, your clothes, and I felt afraid, not of you, but of being reminded that my success is built on such shaky ground that an old truck in a parking lot could threaten it." She paused, gathering herself. "That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. And the truth is, I've become someone I don't recognize, someone who punches down instead of lifting up." Marcus absorbed her words, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no animosity, just a kind of tired understanding. "Ms. Sterling, I appreciate the apology. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, especially publicly. But you need to understand something. What hurt wasn't the attack on me. I've been called worse by better people in worse places. What hurt was that my daughter had to see it. Emma's been through enough. She lost her mother. She's had to adapt to a life that's nothing like what we planned for her. This school is her chance at stability, at opportunities I want to give her, but struggle to provide. And you tried to make her feel like she didn't belong here." His voice remained level, but Victoria could hear the pain beneath the control. Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes, surprising herself. She hadn't cried in years, had trained herself to view tears as weakness in the cutthroat world of luxury real estate. But standing here, faced with the quiet dignity of a man she'd wronged and the ghost of the pain she'd caused a motherless child, the tears came anyway. "You're right," she said, her voice thick. "I hurt a child who's already been hurt by life. That's unforgivable." Marcus watched her cry, noting the genuine remorse rather than the calculated emotion he'd half expected. "People make mistakes, Ms. Sterling. God knows I've made my share. The question is what you do after the mistake. Do you learn from it, or do you just feel bad about it until the feeling fades and you go back to being the same person?" The challenge in his words was clear but not unkind. Victoria wiped her eyes, smearing her expensive mascara, not caring for once about her appearance. "I want to learn. I want to be better. But I don't know how. I've spent so many years building walls, maintaining image, that I don't know how to be real anymore." The admission cost her. Marcus could see that. This woman who commanded boardrooms and million-dollar deals was admitting she didn't know how to be human. It would have been easy to mock her, to take satisfaction in her discomfort. But Marcus had seen too much real evil in the world to take pleasure in someone's genuine attempt at redemption. "Start small," he suggested. "One genuine interaction at a time. Stop looking at people as threats or opportunities, and start seeing them as people." It's not complicated, but it's not easy either. Before Victoria could respond, her phone rang. Without thinking, she declined the call, then did something that surprised them both. She turned the phone completely off and dropped it in her purse. For someone whose life revolved around being constantly connected, the gesture was significant. Marcus noticed a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's a start," he acknowledged. Victoria found herself almost smiling back, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but the possibility of it, the potential for change. "Mr. Brennan, can I ask you something? When you were injured, when you came home, how did you start over? How did you become someone different from who you were?" Marcus considered the question, unconsciously rubbing his left thigh where the shrapnel scars still ached on cold mornings. "I didn't become someone different," he said slowly. "I became who I really was, just stripped of everything that didn't matter. War does that. Loss does that. It burns away the unnecessary until only the essential remains. For me, the essential was Emma. Everything else, pride, career, plans for the future, all of it became secondary to making sure she was okay." He looked directly at Victoria. "You want to change? Find your essential. Find the thing that matters more than your image or your success. Then build from there." Victoria absorbed this, feeling the weight of truth in his words. The problem was, she'd spent so long chasing success that she'd forgotten what else might matter. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Judge Ashworth, who approached with purposeful strides. His expression was carefully neutral as he took in the scene. Victoria with streaked makeup, Marcus standing at ease but watchful. "Miss Sterling, Mr. Brennan," he greeted them formally. "I'm glad I caught both of you. There's something I'd like to discuss." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "This Saturday, Preston Academy is holding its annual fundraising gala. Mr. Brennan, the board would like to honor you at the event, to recognize your service, and to formally welcome you and Emma to our community." Marcus immediately began shaking his head, discomfort clear on his face. "Judge, that's kind, but unnecessary. I don't need recognition." Richard held up a hand. "It's not about what you need, Marcus. It's about what our community needs. We need to remember that heroism comes in many forms, that sacrifice and service matter more than stock portfolios." His gaze shifted meaningfully to Victoria. "And we need to remember that our children are watching us, learning from how we treat each other." Marcus still looked uncomfortable, but before he could refuse again, Victoria spoke up. "He's right, Mr. Brennan. The community needs to see you honored, and frankly, they need to see me standing there applauding you. It's a small step toward making things right." Marcus looked between them, recognizing when he was outmaneuvered. "One condition," he said finally. "No speeches from me. I'll show up, I'll shake hands, but I'm not giving any talks about my service." Richard smiled. "Agreed. Though I reserve the right to say a few words myself." Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made everything look like a postcard. The Preston Academy Gala was held in the school's historic main hall, a space that had been transformed with subtle lighting and elegant decorations. Victoria arrived early, having spent an unusual amount of time preparing, not primping but thinking. She'd chosen a simple black dress, understated jewelry, had even done her own hair. The result was softer, more approachable than her usual armor of designer labels. She positioned herself near the entrance, greeting arriving parents with genuine warmth rather than her usual calculating assessment. Some were surprised by the change, others suspicious, but a few seemed to recognize and appreciate the effort she was making. When Marcus arrived, the room seemed to shift. He wore his army dress uniform, medals precisely positioned, the Purple Heart prominent among them. But it was Emma who drew the most attention, adorable in a blue dress with butterflies embroidered on the skirt, her hand firmly clasped in her father's. The little girl's eyes were wide as she took in the transformed space, the twinkling lights, the elegantly dressed crowd. Victoria watched them enter, saw Marcus's discomfort with the attention, Emma's wonder at the spectacle. Without hesitation, she walked over to them, ignoring the whispers that followed her movement. "Mr. Brennan." "Emma," she said warmly. "Welcome." "Emma, your dress is absolutely beautiful. Are those monarch butterflies? Emma's face lit up at the recognition. Yes, they're my favorites because they fly the furthest. Daddy says they're like soldiers. They go on long journeys and have to be very brave. The innocent comparison made both adults pause, the weight of it settling between them. Victoria knelt to Emma's level, her dress pooling on the floor, not caring about the expensive fabric. They are brave, aren't they? Just like you and your dad. Emma studied her seriously for a moment, then asked with the directness only children possess, "Are you sorry for being mean?" The question cut through all pretense, demanding truth. Victoria met the child's gaze steadily. "Yes, Emma. I'm very sorry. I was wrong and I'm trying to be better." Emma considered this, then nodded decisively. "Okay, Daddy says everyone deserves second chances if they really mean it." "Do you mean it?" Victoria felt her throat tighten. "I do. I really do." Emma turned to her father. "She means it, Daddy, I can tell." The simple acceptance from the child felt like absolution Victoria didn't deserve but desperately needed. The evening progressed with the usual rhythm of such events, mingling, appetizers, polite conversation. But there was an undercurrent of something different. Marcus, despite his discomfort, was gracious with everyone who approached him. He deflected praise, redirected conversations to Emma's achievements at school, asked other parents about their children. It was a masterclass in humility that Victoria watched with growing admiration. She noticed how he made everyone feel important, how he remembered names and details, how he gave his full attention to whoever was speaking. These were skills she'd never developed, too focused on networking to truly connect. When the formal program began, Judge Ashworth took the podium. He spoke eloquently about service, sacrifice, and the different forms of courage. Without naming the incident from earlier in the week, he managed to address it, talking about how true character was revealed not in moments of triumph, but in moments of challenge. Then he called Marcus forward. Despite his earlier stipulation about not speaking, Marcus moved to the front with military bearing, Emma beside him. The room erupted in applause, genuine and sustained. Victoria stood with the rest, clapping until her hands hurt, feeling the inadequacy of the gesture but needing to do it anyway. Marcus accepted the recognition with a simple nod, then did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He held it up for the room to see, his voice carrying clearly without the microphone. "This is Sergeant James Rodriguez and Corporal Michael Chen. They died in the explosion that gave me this." He touched his purple heart. They both had kids, too. Jimmy had 3 boys. Mike had twin daughters. If we're honoring anyone tonight, honor them. Honor all the ones who didn't come home. And honor the families they left behind, the ones doing the real heavy lifting. The room fell silent, the weight of real sacrifice filling the space where polite applause had been. Then slowly, the clapping began again. Different this time. More thoughtful, more genuine. Victoria found tears streaming down her face, not caring who saw. She wasn't alone. Many parents were crying, perhaps thinking of their own children, their own mortality, the price of the freedom they took for granted. Emma reached up and took her father's hand, and in that simple gesture was more eloquence than any speech could have provided. This was what mattered. This was what Marcus had tried to tell her. Find your essential. Everything else was just noise. After the formal program, as people began to drift toward the doors, Victoria found herself standing with Marcus and Emma near the coat check. Emma had fallen asleep in her father's arms, exhausted from the evening's excitement. She looked so small, so trusting, her head on his shoulder, one hand clutching his medal. Victoria helped Marcus carefully put on his coat without waking her, a simple gesture that felt somehow significant. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly. "For what you said to Emma earlier, for being here tonight. It matters to her, even if she doesn't fully understand why yet." Victoria nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Then Marcus surprised her. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" "Not here, not in this world," he gestured at the elegant hall. "Just coffee, somewhere normal. Maybe you can tell me about your essential when you find it." Victoria felt something shift in her chest, like ice cracking on a frozen river. She wasn't sure what it meant, this invitation, this possibility of friendship with someone she'd wronged so badly, but she knew it was a gift she hadn't earned, but wanted to deserve. "I'd like that," she said simply. Marcus nodded, then carried his sleeping daughter toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back. "Miss Sterling?" "Victoria," she corrected. "Please call me Victoria." "Victoria, then." "That first day you were right about one thing. My truck is held together with duct tape and prayer. But you know what? It still runs. It gets us where we need to go. Sometimes that's all that matters. Just keeping moving forward, even if it's not pretty." The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. Victoria understood. Redemption wasn't going to be elegant or easy. It was going to be held together with effort and hope, and maybe that was enough. Over the following months, Victoria found herself changing in ways she couldn't have predicted. The coffee with Marcus became a weekly occurrence, always at a small diner halfway between their neighborhoods. They talked about everything and nothing, about Emma's progress in school, about the challenges of single parenthood that Marcus faced, about Victoria's struggle to redefine success in terms that weren't purely financial. Slowly, carefully, they built something that might have been friendship. Victoria started volunteering at the school, not in the prestigious parent association roles she'd previously coveted, but in the library, reading to children, helping with homework. She discovered she was good with kids, patient in ways she'd never been with adults. She found herself defending Marcus when other parents made snide comments about his truck or his clothes, using her considerable social capital to shift the narrative. She made sure Emma was included in birthday parties and playdates, not through manipulation, but through genuine advocacy. And slowly the other parents began to see what Victoria had initially missed, that Marcus Brennan and his daughter brought something valuable to their community, something that couldn't be bought or sold. They brought authenticity, resilience, the reminder that character mattered more than credentials. Emma blossomed at Preston, her natural intelligence and creativity flourishing in an environment where she was supported and valued. She never forgot her butterflies, often drawing parallels between metamorphosis and the changes she saw around her, including in Ms. Victoria, who had become Aunt Vicky, a transformation that surprised everyone, most of all, Victoria herself. One spring afternoon, Victoria stood in the Preston Academy parking lot, watching as Marcus's old truck finally gave up. It simply stopped, right there in the parking space, with a final wheeze that sounded almost peaceful. Marcus stood looking at it with a mixture of frustration and sadness. It had carried them through so much, been the constant in their lives when everything else was chaos. Without hesitation, Victoria walked over. "Looks like the duct tape and prayer finally ran out," she said gently. Marcus laughed, a real laugh that transformed his usually serious face. "Yeah, I guess they did." He ran his hand along the truck's hood, a farewell gesture. "Emma's going to be heartbroken. She loves this truck." Victoria made a decision that would have seemed impossible months ago. "Take my car. I'll call a ride service." Marcus started to protest, but she held up her hand. "Not charity. Not pity. Just one friend helping another. That's what people do, right? They help each other?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "That's what friends do," he agreed. As Victoria handed over her keys to the Bentley, she realized she'd found her essential. It wasn't success or money or status. It was connection, community, the ability to see people for who they really were and to let them see her in return. The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic. Like Emma's butterflies, it had been a slow metamorphosis, happening in stages, sometimes painful, always necessary. Marcus had been right that first day. You don't become someone different. You become who you really were, stripped of everything that doesn't matter. And standing in that parking lot, next to a broken-down truck and a borrowed luxury car, with a decorated war hero who worked construction, and a little girl who understood butterflies better than most adults understood life, Victoria finally understood that the most beautiful things really did come from difficult changes. The story could have ended there, but life doesn't wrap up neatly like fiction. 3 years later, at Emma's 5th-grade graduation, Marcus and Victoria sat side by side in the Preston Academy auditorium. They weren't a couple, though many had speculated. They were something perhaps more valuable, genuine friends who had seen each other at their worst and chosen to help each other become their best. Emma stood at the podium, delivering the student address, her topic unsurprising to anyone who knew her: metamorphosis, changes that make us stronger. She spoke about butterflies, of course, but also about people, about how sometimes we have to break down completely before we can rebuild into something beautiful. She thanked her father for showing her that strength wasn't about being unbreakable, but about getting up every time you fell. And she thanked Aunt Vicky for showing her that people could change, that apologies could be real, that second chances could lead to something wonderful. In the audience, Victoria felt Marcus's hand briefly squeeze hers, a gesture of shared pride in the remarkable child they'd both had a part in raising. Not as parents, but as a village, the kind of village that every child deserves, but too few receive. The old truck had been replaced with a reliable sedan, purchased with Marcus's saved earnings, and a promotion to site supervisor at the construction company. Victoria's Bentley had long since been traded for something more practical, the money difference donated to a veterans organization that helped soldiers transition to civilian life. These were small changes that reflected bigger transformations, the slow work of becoming better people, better citizens, better friends. As Emma left the stage to thunderous applause, her butterfly dress from years ago replaced with the confident bearing of a young woman who knew her worth, Victoria realized that the confrontation in the parking lot 3 years ago hadn't been a disaster. It had been a gift, the catalyst that forced her to examine who she'd become and decide who she wanted to be. Marcus had been her mirror, reflecting back the ugliness she'd cultivated, but also the potential for beauty she'd almost forgotten existed. And Emma, dear, wise Emma, had been the teacher, showing them both that transformation was always possible, that even the most unlikely people could lift each other up if they were willing to let go of what weighed them down. The applause continued, parents and teachers on their feet, celebrating not just Emma, but all the children who were moving forward, carrying with them the lessons of these formative years. Victoria stood with the rest, no longer concerned about maintaining an image or protecting her status. She was simply a woman who had learned to see clearly, to value what mattered, to understand that the truest wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with the connections we forge through kindness, humility, and the courage to change. And in that auditorium, surrounded by a community that had witnessed and participated in her transformation, Victoria Sterling finally understood what Marcus had meant about finding your essential. It had been there all along, waiting beneath the surface, ready to emerge when she was finally brave enough to let her old self go and embrace the metamorphosis that would reveal who she really was.